Well, my favourite definition of revival is that it's waking up to reality. It's waking up to reality because reality is the world as it is perceived by God. It's God's perspective on things.
Well, hello and welcome to the Great Southland Revival podcast series. In this series, myself and Warwick are interviewing a huge array of Australian authors and academics and historians as we tap into the topic of revival and Australia's Christian history. So today I have the amazing privilege of speaking with Stuart Piggin. Stuart Piggin is a name you very well may have heard if you've read much of Australia's Christian history before. He's a prolific author. He's a historian, a man of letters. In terms of a brief biography, Stuart has lectured in religious history at both the University of Wollongong and the University of Sydney for some 15 years. He was the director of the Centre for the History of Christian Thought and Experience at Macquarie University. Stuart is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a fellow of the Religious History Association of Australia. Stuart's written over 100 articles for academic journals and is the author of at least 7 books, 3 of which actually I have in front of me here. And I'll just profile very briefly because I want to encourage people to be aware of and read these amazing works of Australian Christian history. So The Fountain of Public Prosperity, which is volume 1 of a 2-series set that Stuart authored with Robert Linder, and the second one is Attending to the National Soul, which I also highly encourage. I'm sure we'll mention these in a few minutes, and also Firestorm of the Lord. Again, I'll mention these ones as we go in conversation, but I want to say, first of all, a huge welcome, Stuart, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Kurt, for your huge welcome. It's a huge privilege. Thank you.
Excellent. Great to be with you. And I thought I'd perhaps ask Stuart, because we're talking about revival, we're talking about people coming to faith and what God does in the lives of individuals and in the lives of nations. I'd love to hear, I've given a brief profile of your sort of professional background, but would love to hear just a little bit about your personal faith journey, your journey to Christ, if you could share a bit of that with us.
Sure, thank you. I suppose my journey is reasonably familiar in Australia. In 1959, Billy Graham came to Australia. My family were living 600 k's away from Sydney, but my brother was at Hawkesbury Agricultural College in Richmond, and he was invited by his uncle to attend one of the crusades, and he attended and he accepted Christ as his Lord and Saviour. And following that, our whole family came to Christ. My parents came to Christ, and then
Wow.
I came to Christ and my 2 younger sisters. The influence of that uncle who invited my brother to the crusade continued throughout our life. He was the headmaster of Trinity Grammar School, Rod West, and he was the sort of guy who took Christ with him everywhere. And I remember when I was on study leave in Yale, I'm being nostalgic now, Kurt, because you're bringing up things which are precious to me, I guess. And I've just been thinking about these things. And I remember I was on study leave in Yale, which is where one of the founders of the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, studied. And there's a Jonathan Edwards College at Yale University. And it was a great privilege to go there and spend a study leave there. Anyway, Rod West visited us there. And we went down to the green in the centre of the Yale village. It's very beautiful. There are 3 churches across the green, and we went into one of them. I suppose it was the Episcopalian church because we were Anglicans, Episcopalians. And you need to know that part of America, the northeast of America, it's as swanky, it's as posh, it's as upmarket as the poshest parts of Britain. I mean, these are not your normal Yanks. these are really, people who pride themselves on their culture and all the rest of it. But there we were in this church, and the minister asked us to sing that revival song, "Revive Us Again." Hallelujah, thine the glory, revive us again. I remember my uncle standing there singing this song at the top of his voice in this in this glorious part of the world. It was really with the snow outside on the green, and it was an experience of great beauty. But so that's my background.
That's amazing.
Mm.
Wow, awesome! Thank you so much for sharing that, and for reflecting on it as well in the lead up to our conversation today.
Well, I did want to say about that and this is I'm sorry, I got a bit sidetracked on my uncle, but in
No, that's great.
1989, which was 30 years after the Billy Graham Crusade, I was asked by the principal of Moore Theological College to give a lecture on the Billy Graham Crusades, and by that time I had made a study of revival, which I hadn't, of course, in 1959. I was far too young, but in 1989 I'd made a study of revival by then, and I came to the conclusion that this was the Billy Graham Crusades experience in Australia was a genuine revival. One of the important essential characteristics, I believe, of genuine revival, which distinguishes revival from other spiritual experiences in the church, is that it's something which spills out beyond the church into the wider community. It's got to influence the wider community. And my rector, my Anglican minister at the time, down in Fig Tree in Wollongong, who was a very bright bloke, PhD in physics and all the rest of it, he said to me, "Well, if you're going to prove this is a revival, you've got to have a look at the crime statistics and the statistics of to do with moral behaviour and alcohol consumption, all those sorts of things." And so we did that, and as a result of that, I think it's one of the few times that anybody's done this for the Billy Graham Crusade. But we did this, and we found out that in Australia, Billy Graham made a real impact on Australians. Not only did it greatly increase church going, but all the crime indices dipped after Billy Graham, and the consumption of alcohol, consumption of beer went down after Billy Graham was here. So
it's amazing.
Yeah, it was a real. I mean, when you read the newspapers at the time, you read about people talking about their marriages being healed and families coming together again, all those sorts of things. So that was
It's amazing.
revival, I think.
Yeah, I think I've read also in some of what you've written that births out of wedlock, the rate of that decreased compared to the years both before and after the Billy Graham Crusades. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a moral non-criminal indice. And what was alarming Australians in the 1950s was, of course, the Cold War and the fear of nuclear war and so on. But also there was I think, a justified anxiety in Australia about the great decline of Australians into a moral state that was less than desirable, and that was one indicator that things slowed down a bit for a while. Then of course, it went very bad again in the late 60s, in the 70s.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. That's fascinating. Well, we've already started talking a little bit about revival, and I guess before we get too much into the details, because we really do want to, talk about Australia's revival history, I'd love to know, just from a personal point of view, where did your passion for revival begin? You've shared a little bit about your time at Yale and about your own sort of personal conversion, but revival as a topic of interest, how did that come about?
Yeah. In 1974, I was appointed to a lectureship in history at Wollongong University, and I've always been. I grew up on a farm, and it was very flat. And Wollongong fascinated me because it's so hilly and so green and so incredibly beautiful. But the most beautiful part of it is Mount Kembla. And in 1902 at Mount Kembla, there was the worst mine disaster in Australian history. 96 men and boys were killed. It's the worst disaster in Australia before the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria in 2009. And so I began to make a study of this disaster because I was a member of the church which met at Mount Kembla. It's in the parish of Fig Tree. And that church is known as the Miners and Soldiers Memorial Church. So it still commemorates the disaster. And it kept the memory of the disaster going. So I got interested in this disaster. What I found amazing was that when you go around the cemeteries, there are two big cemeteries up there with disaster victims in them. You'll be astonished at the sentiments on the headstones. Come Christ, come quickly to Christ, make no delay, for no one knows his judgment day. Things like this.
Wow.
You get this feeling that these are a very religious people, really. And I got a bit of a surprise because we'd been taught by all the secular historians that Australians take death nonchalantly. They don't terribly, but they don't think about it at all. But here there were these headstones which had these Christian sentiments, very strongly so. But then I came across something even more amazing. That in the months just before the disaster, there was a genuine religious revival in Mount Kembla.
Wow.
And then I found that this genuine religious revival took place in all the coal mining villages in the Illawarra. They dot the Illawarra coastline like beads on a string, and people got converted in their hundreds. 175 in Mount Kembla and 232 in Helensburgh, and 250 in Bulli, and so I'm just making the figures up, but they're that sort of order. I just can't remember the figures, but it was a genuine religious revival. And so that's what really started it, I think. What I have since found is that revival in the Illawarra coalfields was actually part of a much wider revival, which took place in New South Wales and particularly in Melbourne. In Melbourne, it was known in 1902 as the big revival. And I think probably Australia came close to a sort of Australia-wide awakening in 1902. Now, this all surprised me when I first discovered this revival at Mount Kembla in 1902, because I thought that revival was not an Australian thing. I thought it was an American thing. I thought there'd never been a religious revival. I didn't know. I didn't know there'd been any revivals in Australia. So I got quite a surprise. So since then, we've found scores of revivals, and in the books which you kindly mentioned, we list large numbers of them. It's been a fairly frequent experience in Australian history.
It's amazing. I think I saw somewhere that you've documented at least 71. Is that right? Or perhaps that might have been a figure from a decade or so ago. Perhaps you've even found more than that.
Yes, I think that's right. Something like that. Yeah, but I mean, it all depends on your definition of revival and so on. Maybe we can come back
of course
in the duration of the interview.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I'd also love to ask, just in terms of, I guess, Australia's Christian foundations, when I was reading The Fountain of Public Prosperity, so this is a book that I believe won Christian Book of the Year, is that right? For
2018,
I think 18 or, something like that. I just really encourage everyone to get a hold of this. It's quite a tome. It's a big book, but it's been super encouraging for me, and it took me a while to work my way through it, but it was so that I could sort of digest it, just the vast Christian history of our nation, which I think so often has been forgotten. But one of the things that fascinated me in The Fountain of Public Prosperity is just how intentional Christians were about this new land called Australia, who were coming from Europe and wanting to really settle the nation as a Christian place. And the appointment of Richard Johnson as, I believe he was the chaplain on the First Fleet, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about that, about the intent, the Christian intentions for Australia, and a bit of that story around Richard Johnson?
Yes. Well, thank you. The important thing to know about all this, I think, is that even white Australian history doesn't begin in 1788 with the First Fleet. Mm-hmm. And so in our first of our two volumes, we go back to 1740, to the Great Awakening, because there's a direct link between the Great Awakening and the settlement of Australia. It's actually quite an amazing story, I think. One of the great preachers of the Great Awakening was George Whitefield, possibly the greatest preacher the church has ever had in terms of his capacity to reject the dramatic gospel. And one of the persons who was converted under him was a descendant of the Huguenots, Protestant Christians from France, called Margaret Gambier, and she married Charles Middleton and infused her faith into Charles, and Charles became the controller of the Navy, and it was Charles Middleton who put together the First Fleet, and he decided that he wanted to have ships which wouldn't sink like slave traders. He wanted to make sure that this experience would be nothing like the slave trade. because the evangelicals, of which he was one, an early one, they believed in the abolition of the slave trade. So they didn't want this first fleet to be anything like that. So he made sure that these ships were seaworthy and safe, and he also made sure they were well provisioned so that nobody was hungry. So the amazing thing is that hardly anybody died on the first fleet. It was a great maritime miracle. You don't read about this, you don't learn about this at school, but this is because the secular historians have left all this out. But in actual fact, the first fleet was a great maritime achievement. Hardly anybody died. The convicts got off the ships heavier than when they got on because they were so well provisioned. This is an amazing thing. And I think that if you look at the impact of Christianity on Australia, I mean, you mentioned the fact that this was a very big book. Well, we had to write 2 very big books because there's just so much to say about the enormous impact. I mean, Christianity is probably the most formative influence on Australian history by a long way, but it's been left out by our secular historians. So the books had to be long. And while you did say that you waded through it, my wife said that they're well written, by the way. She read them. She read them avidly, and she enjoyed the way.
Yeah.
But anyway, there are lots of stories. And, Christianity made a big influence on our education system, on the legal system, on the labour movement, you name it, sort of every part of Australian medical welfare system, charities and so on. And if you look, for example, at the labour movement, the great founder of the labour movement in Australia before the formation of the Labor Party was William Guthrie Spence, and Spence House is the name of the union movement house in Melbourne. But what they don't tell you about Spence down there probably is that he was a devout evangelical Christian, a Methodist and a Presbyterian lay preacher, and his book on the labour movement is full of the language of revival, including the title of the book, Australia's Awakening. Wow. So you don't have to look far, not only to see the influence of Christianity, but the influence of revival, revived Christianity on Australia. You just find it everywhere if you go looking for it.
That's awesome. That's so good. And so Richard Johnson, what was the story with his appointment? And he preached the first sermon, I believe, on Australian soil.
Yes. Richard Johnson was an evangelical curate in London, and he was probably approached by John Newton, the converted slave trader, and by William Wilberforce.
Wow.
And this is a huge deal to go overseas. Nobody knew anything about it. It was the longest trip that anybody had taken, and it was an extraordinary thing to agree to do it. But I think he's one of the great heroes, actually. He was temperamentally, I think, rather a gentle and shy fella. But he stayed there for 11 years, and the convicts really respected him. He was very good at pastoral work, I think. He used to just sit down with them and talk to them. And he was really quite incredibly successful. He was the one who preached the first sermon under a big gum tree, which is in the spot is now marked by a monument in Sydney. It's good just to stand there and reflect on how he would have preached about 800 male convicts on that site 8 days after the fleet first landed. There are a lot of myths about this.
Wow.
It is thought that that Australians were anti-religious right from the start because convicts were not particularly religious and because they didn't have a church service on the first Sunday. But if you look into it, you find that that Richard Johnson put an enormous amount of effort into making that service a success, choosing the spot, making sure that everything was set in place. These things just don't happen. And so I think it was quite something, really. And he was the one who built the first church.
Yeah. Incredible. So you were sort of summarising a number of different influences that Christianity or even revival Christianity has had on Australia. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more? So I guess another way to ask that question is, how has Christianity shaped the Australia that we all know and love? You know, we're in 2022 now, and so much has changed. Australia is a lot more secular, but even I would say there's a lot of remnants of the Christian influence still in our culture today. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that probably it's influenced every aspect of Australian life. It is said, for example, that the Australian culture was first of all formed um, by the early chaplains. They were given the responsibility for education in the colony. They were the ones who established the first schools and appointed the first school teachers.
Wow.
William Wilberforce was incredibly involved in all of this. There are lots of letters that he wrote to the early Australian chaplains and the governors and so on. And he was very keen that the Christian influence should be front and centre in the development of Australia. And if you look at the various governors, um, the thing that most historians emphasise is that Philip, the first governor, was very influenced by the Enlightenment, and therefore was not overtly Christian. But I think that's also a bit of a myth, because if you look at one of the maps that he first of all uh, developed himself for the development of Sydney, smack in the middle of it is a site for the church. He intended for a major church to be built smack in the middle of the new colony. So even he was probably more Christian than our secular historians make out. There was certainly anti-Christian activity by his successor, Gross, who was an unsavoury piece of work. But then you got governors like Hunter and of course Macquarie, very committed Christians really, and did a great deal for the Christian presence in Sydney at that time. Um, then when you go on from the education system to the legal system and the development of our governing institutions, including the democratic element in Australia and the heading towards federation, you find that the Christian influence is very strong there, and the best book on Australian federation begins with the words that God intended Australia to be a federation. That's how the historian begins it, because if you look at all the sermons were preached at the time, the clergy were fascinated by the possibility and wanted to make sure that Australia was, a godly place. There were problems and things that, when we look back, were not as pleasing as they should have been, such as the White Australia policy. But again, it was Christians like Alan Walker in the 50s who were chiefly responsible for getting rid of the White Australia policy.
That's awesome. Yeah, wow. Now, we will start talking a little bit more about revival specifically. So I guess before we do that, to lay the groundwork, how would you define revival? This is something that you've picked up in a number of your books. So I know you've got a fairly well thought out answer to this. How do you define revival, Stuart?
This is a very important question, I think. And there's a sort of a short answer and there's a long answer. Have you got time for me to give you both? That'd be great if you did.
Both sounds fantastic.
Well, my favourite definition of revival is that it's waking up to reality. It's waking up to reality, because reality is the world as it is perceived by God. It's God's perspective on things. That's what reality is. And when revival comes along, it's always a surprise and a shock to people, because God's perspective on things is nearly always so different from our own. And we suddenly realise that the things that we were taking for granted aren't necessarily the way things are. For example, I think that the reality is that God is far more concerned about sin and the devil than we are. There's a sort of spiritual dimension to all of this that we have, under our secular influence, we've tended to, even though we're Christians, we've tended to put behind us. And we don't like talking about sin much, and we certainly don't like talking about the devil. And yet, suddenly things happen, like a Russian premier invades Ukraine or something, and we look at it and we think, how can this be? This is so preposterous. This is so awful. This this looks satanic, doesn't it? And you begin to think that maybe there is such a thing as pure evil, and there is such a thing as the satanic, and it's helpful to realise that. So that's sort of one part of the dimension of waking up to reality, the reality that there is a spiritual dimension which is going to be hard fought in this world, in this life. The second thing is that the reality is that in God, through the wonderful agency of his Son Jesus and the power of the Spirit, people's potential is far greater than we realise. There is an enlargement, a potential for greatness, for influence, which is positive and godly, which is far greater than we normally give ourselves credit for. That, I think, is another part of a revival. So revivals so often meet people's genuine needs and transform and correct them so that things are better in the future. If you think about the revivals we've talked about already, such as that in 1902, it was not only a revival in the coal mining villages, but it was also a revival across the colonies. And at that time, Australia had been through a 10-year drought, probably the longest drought in Australian white history, and a terrible economic recession. Things were really, really grim. And revival came as some sort of answer to that, I think, some sort of social answer to that. If you look at Billy Graham in 1959, if you think about that as revival, then this was in the time of the fear of the Cold War. There was great anxiety in Australia at that time about the Cold War and about moral decline, as I mentioned. So revival comes as some sort of response to that. And it means that it's moving you forward into a better future. Now, some people regret the fact that revivals end. But what revivals do is they reset things so that you're starting.
Yeah.
You do have words like refreshment and restoration and so on. That those sort of words give you the impression that you're just going back to where you were before, restoring things as they were before. But in actual fact, revivals probably don't do that only. They always take you beyond that. They take you to a new point of departure, and then you start again. So there's that about that's a second reality. If the first one's a negative reality about sin and the devil, the next one's a positive reality about how wonderful the potential is in God. But the reality, as I've said, is God, and therefore what revivals ultimately do is that they start to get people focused. The focus is off themselves, so they no longer think about themselves so much and their own needs. They're no longer thinking about how God can meet their needs. They start to think about who God is in himself, in his glory. The great prayer for revival is, come down, Lord, where your glory fills the heavens, and may it cover the earth with your glory and your purity and your truth. God in himself for who he is in his own glory. That's the ultimate taste and aspiration that people develop when they are influenced by a genuine revival, I think. So that's my short answer. Namely, it's waking up to reality, but I just thought we'd need to unpack it. But in the book Firestorm of the Lord, which you mentioned, there is on page 11 my definition, which is it's in two paragraphs, and the first paragraph is a theological definition, and the second paragraph is a historical definition. And why I gave both is that I'm not a theologian, but revival is obviously something you've got to understand in terms of biblical revelation. So you have to have the theological understanding. And what I basically said there is that revival is the work of the Holy Trinity, because the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are involved in doing their unique work in sanctifying and converting and regenerating and empowering people. But then there are these historical dimensions to it, which are important, because when you think about revival, the question is, how is it possible to be involved in promoting revival? How can we cooperate with the Lord in order to do the work of the Lord? Christians understand that God is sovereign, that revival is always a sovereign work of God. It won't happen unless the Spirit's present. I mean, you can work yourself up into all sorts of emotional frenzies and all the rest, but that's not revival. Revival's only real when God's there. But revivals, humanly speaking, are nearly always preceded by certain things, by extraordinary prayerfulness, by exceptional expectation. So people expect that something's about to happen. People start to get excited. And also by unprecedented unity among Christians. So the Christians who squabble among themselves about the things that they think are important suddenly think, just a minute, these things are not nearly as important as what we have in common. So you get Catholics and Protestants getting together again and enjoying life in the Spirit and so on. So revivals have those characteristics. Now, historians can write about those things because you can find evidence for greater prayerfulness. You can find evidence for great expectation. You can find evidence for unity among Christians. So these are the things which help you to write about revivals.
Yeah, and it is striking how true the historical definition that you've just given. As you were explaining that, I was thinking back through some of the big revivals in Australian history that we've already mentioned. The 1902 Illawarra and Melbourne revival, and also the Billy Graham Crusades. Those things were very much in evidence: the unity, the expectation, the prayerfulness. It is strikingly true.
Yes, the prayer before the Billy Graham Crusades was just a spiritual explosion. People, there were scores of places to go to pray, and people just prayed all night. They prayed for hours and hours and hours, and they wanted to. If you're not in a revival situation, prayer is hard work. But if you're in a revival situation, it just comes, and you just want to be there in the presence of the Lord. It's just delightful.
Yeah. It's amazing. Awesome. Well, we've talked about a few different, revivals from Australian history. Is there one that you would say is your favourite that hasn't been mentioned so far?
Well, I suppose my favourite is the one I discovered first, namely at Mount Kembla, because we historians, we're very sinful and we are proud of the things we discover, you see. So, I guess that one's important to me. But I guess for another reason, I don't know if I think you mentioned that you got to the end of our first volume, but at the end of our first volume, we suggest humbly that maybe the Welsh revival, the Great Welsh Revival, might have even begun in New South Wales. So
that is fascinating.
Old Wales, maybe the revival really began in New South Wales, and there's evidence for that. And I'd be interested to see what your readers, if they read the book, what they think of our evidence. But the reason
absolutely,
the reason why we suspected that in the first place was because of the amazing experience in the Mount Kembla revival or the coal mine revivals, that the pit ponies stopped working because they could no longer understand the commands of the miners because they started to speak with a pure speech. And
amazing.
I thought that was amazing. But when I read about the Welsh revival, I found that exactly the same thing happened there. Now, it's important to say that, this sounds like evangelical hagiography or something. This sounds unbelievable. But that is testified to in the South Coast Times, in the secular press, in the Illawarra. It's not just something made up by Christians to. It really happened, I think. But then it happened in Wales.
Yeah.
But it happened in New South Wales first. It happened in New South Wales 2 years before it happened in Wales. And therefore I wondered if there was some sort of connection between the two. And then I went and looked for all sorts of other evidence as well. Found all sorts of evidence. One of the what we haven't talked about is that revival is relatively common among Aboriginal people. There have been lots of little revivings among Aboriginal people, and including one very big revival, 1979 to 1982, which began in Elcho Island. It swept across the Northern Territory and across central Western Australia and was very important in meeting the needs of Aboriginal people who, as you understand, were demoralised and feeling disadvantaged strongly, and this increased their dignity and was a very powerful, empowering force for them. God, in His love, meeting their needs. Once you were no people, but now you are a people, the people of God. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10. So that was a great thing. But in Sydney, there's an Aboriginal pastor who's an Anglican pastor, very significant work among the Aboriginal people, by the name of Ray Minikin. And I met his brother Rodney when I was in Wollongong University many years ago. And I said to him, Rodney, have you ever been involved in a revival? And he just laughed and he said, I've been involved in 30 revivals.
Wow.
And I've since found out that Rodney and Ray were the products of of a revival in Pinnacle Pocket in the Atherton Tableland in Queensland. Their father was the pastor of that church. But the interesting thing is that the pastor before him, the pastor before Rodney and Ray's father, was a product of the Welsh revival. He come out of the Welsh revival, come to Queensland, and he established the church. Now, you can find videos about this readily on the net, on the Pinnacle Pocket Revival. I'd encourage your viewers to look at it. It's very exciting stuff.
Yeah.
And you can see the ongoing impact of this, the Welsh revival. Maybe the New South Wales impacting the Welsh revival, impacting the Queensland Pinnacle Pocket Revival, impacting
zigzags all around the world.
On and on.
There and back again.
Yeah. I think what this means is that revivals are things which tend to be caught rather than taught. You catch fire from others who have experienced them. So that's an important dimension to all of this, I think.
It is. Yeah, super encouraging. I've actually just finished reading Fire in the Outback as well. So that's the story of the Elcho Island revival that went to Warburton and, central WA and Northern Territory, as you've explained. Do you know, Stuart, if there's still much evidence of that taking place today, or not so much evidence, but has that revival reignited? Is there still significant spiritual life in those communities, or have things sort of, I guess, settled down again? What's your understanding of that?
Now, who was it again who wrote that book on the
So that's John Blackett, I believe.
John Blackett. Now he would be able to answer that question. John has done amazing work. See, one of the reasons why that book is so important is that it includes the voice of Aboriginal people. It includes their testimony. It's great to hear the testimony of those who have actually experienced revival. And I think that book is a very important book that John Blackett has put together there. He's a very important source of information on all of this, far more that I could help you with, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's great. Awesome. Well, you do write a lot about the Pacific Islands revivals in both the Fountain of Public Prosperity and particularly in Attending to the National Soul. You've dealt with it in quite a bit of depth there because I guess Australia's influence in the Pacific Islands has been reasonably significant. And I guess I'm interested to hear a bit more from you as to how big that role has been, because I know that one of the intentions of believers who settled Australia and who were praying for Australia from the outset is that there would be a Christian presence in the South Pacific Islands and in the Asia kind of region. So to what extent has Australia helped ignite fires of revival in the Pacific Islands, and perhaps vice versa? Has there been an influence back from the Pacific Islands to Australia?
Great questions. The evangelicals who sent out Richard Johnson were very keen, as you've pointed out, that Australia should be used as a base for missions to the South Seas. See, when the great missionary movement began in the 1790s, in response to revival fires with the Baptist mission to India and so on, there's a great debate about where you should send your missionaries to. And there were those who said, we should send them to India because India is a high civilization and people who are highly civilized are more likely to become Christians first. And there were others who said, no, we need to send them to the people who are the most needy. We need to send them to the islanders of the South Seas. So, of course, they sent them to both. missions to India were very important, and missions to the South Seas were very important. And there were great books written on all of this. J. Edwin Orr wrote a book about evangelical awakenings in the South Seas. It's hard to come by, but Robert Evans, who has written more books on on revivals in Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific than anybody else, on the net you'll find a little thing of his that's written on evangelical revivals in the Pacific Islands and Papua New Guinea, and you can just work through those, and it's a good way of catching up on this very quickly. But why this is so important is that, as you've suggested, Australia has been involved in the Pacific. It's very important involvement, and as you know, it's currently in the news at the moment because of the conflict with France, and the French have also been very influential in the South Seas. But what it meant was that unlike India, the missionaries to the South Seas were incredibly successful. In India was hard going, but in the Pacific Islands, within a generation or so, most of the islanders became Christians. And what that means is that you've got a Christian presence there in the Pacific, which is facing over against the alternative belief systems of Asia, over to the West. So strategically, from the point of view of God's history, the point of view of the future of Christianity in world history, these are very significant things that have happened, I think. So when Wilberforce and company were laying the foundation of the base for the missionising of the South Seas, it was something of great potential. Now, often the islanders became Christians through revivals. So in 1813, for example, Tahiti, which at first was a very dangerous place for the missionaries to go, 1813-15 went over to Christianity following the conversion of King Pomare, and he built a church which held 3 times as many worshippers as St Paul's Cathedral.
Wow.
These are big things. In 1834, revival came to Tonga, and a couple of thousand came to the Lord in just a few days. There's another big revival there in 1846. Samoa was evangelised from Tahiti. There were significant revivals there in 1835 and again in 1840. Revival broke out in Hawaii, which was missionised from America, and that continued that revival for 5 years. In Fiji, Fiji was visited by John Watsford, who was an Australian-born Methodist, who took revival with him wherever he went. An amazing guy. Worth reading his biography. But Fiji had been a very bloodthirsty place. Cannibalism was rife there. But there was a spectacular revival in Fiji in 1845 to 46. And if you go to Fiji today and go to their churches, listen to their singing, you'll know that this is a product of a genuine religious revival. Coming up into the 20th century, in 1906 in Australia, there were very significant revivals among Kanakas, who were the sugar workers who were imported to work the sugar in Queensland. Genuine revival there in 1906. They were then sent back under the White Australia policy to the Solomon Islands under the White Australia policy, and they took the gospel with them. So interesting the way God works. And then in more recent times, there was a really spectacular revival in the Solomon Islands in 1970, written about a beautiful book written on this by a woman called Griffiths. And the Griffiths have been associated with the South Seas Evangelical Mission and the South Seas Evangelical Church for generations. One of the great things about Australian history is the way Christianity creates these Christian dynasties, and they just go on from generation to generation doing good work for the Lord. Then in 1972, there was a revival in Papua New Guinea, and from that, some of the leaders of Papua have come. Some of the Australian evangelicals established a leaders training centre in Papua New Guinea to train people not only to lead the church, but also to lead the nation. And there's a lot of Christian leadership in the Pacific Islands. And it's interesting when you think about our economic and political involvement with these countries, how important the Christian influence might be. A wise minister dealing with these matters for the government would take into account the Christian presence and what Christians have to contribute.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, that's awesome. Wow, so much there for me to dig into as I continue researching. So thank you. Now, looking to, I guess, more of sort of the situation today. In recent decades, I guess revivals have been less frequent in Australia, and I'd say that they've been actually a lot more frequent in the global south. So, I guess India and South America, Indonesia, China. Why do you think that is? Why has it shifted from, I guess, revivals that were much more commonplace in Western nations decades ago to now the developing world or the global south?
Yes. I don't know that I've got a good answer for this, but the beginnings of an answer is that in the 19th century, when small local revivals were relatively common in Australia, they were common in Methodist circles. And that's largely, I think, because Methodists expected revival. And they prayed for it and they had confidence. They didn't start evangelistic meetings until they believed that the Spirit had come and filled them with himself, so that they went out in confidence that the preaching of the gospel would be honoured. We normally have the reverse. So we have an evangelistic meeting and we hope that the Spirit will come later and cash in on it. But I think the Methodists had the reverse view. They'd pray for the coming of the Spirit, then they have the meetings. So they were relatively common. In Australia today, the heirs to revival expecting Methodists are the Pentecostals, the charismatic Christians, and they are the fastest growing Australian churches. But they're only a little over 1%, I think, of the Australian population.
Right.
Whereas in other parts of the global south that you mentioned, the Pentecostal churches are a much larger percentage of the population. In Africa and in South America in particular, Pentecostals can be a third of the population.
Wow.
And therefore you have a lot more people praying and expecting revival in those countries. Indeed, as we sit here, Christianity is growing more rapidly in the world than it's ever done. There are thousands of people who become Christians every day. And
I missed that number. Sorry, how many
well,
is
it's
that?
tens of thousands, I think. Barrett started
Wow.
this encyclopedia of Christianity in the world, didn't he? And the figures of the people who are coming to Christ are spectacular. In Australia,
Wow.
most people become Christians by being born of Christian parents. That's by far the largest percentage of people who become Christians. But the family in Australia is not as healthy as it used to be. A, they don't have any children. B, families separate, and when they separate, people stop going to church. Well, they don't. The parents don't take their children to church as much as they did because they're having other things to worry about. So it's a real problem in Australia, which you don't have perhaps in some of these other countries. But I think that the revivals in those countries are something which will make Christianity continue to grow very dynamically in the global south in a way that we don't experience in the west.
Definitely, and I guess as the years go on, we're already seeing a bit of this, but I'm sure we'll see more of it where Australia actually becomes a mission field for believers from those nations we've just been talking about.
Yes.
That God does something amazing in their nation, in their church, in their life, and they end up coming to Australia to bring that with them. So,
well, exactly. One of the most remarkable revivals that Australians were responsible for were revivals in Korea at the beginning of the 20th century. Very significant revivals. And as you know, about a third of the Korean population now is Christian. And they are now the second largest missionary sending country in the world, I think, behind the United States. And they have sent missionaries to Australia, but they're most successful in missions to their own people, so that Korean immigrants normally have something to do with the church. I've heard that there are 500 Korean churches in Sydney alone. And I was talking to one of my doctoral students, my PhD students. I was supervising them at the University of Wollongong. He said he was the pastor of a Korean church, and I said, "Oh, you're the head pastor, eh?" "Oh no," he said, "I'm just one of many pastors." I said, "Well, how many pastors do you have?" And he said, "Well, we have about 30 pastors." So these churches, some of these churches are huge.
Wow.
It's amazing. So yeah, you get a lot of spiritual energy. I think it's interesting to think about. I call it the national spiritual equivalent. How there are some nations which seem to have greater spiritual energy and fire than others, and Korea seems to be one of them. I mean, Jesus is the desire of the nations. Some nations seem to desire Jesus in a way which unleashes revival. It'd be a great tragedy in Australia if Australia as a nation never understood what God intended for it to be in the history of the gospel, outreach in the world. Yeah.
That's so true. And that really brings us very nicely to the last question I'd love to ask you, Stuart, which is, what do you think it would take for Australia to see revival again?
Well, if you go back to the definition, expectation, prayer, unity, the things that we can do are to work on those things. And to realise that while revivals, to be genuine, have to spread out into the wider community, they begin with the church, which means they begin with us, which means they begin with me, which means they begin with you. So revivals begin by making nominal Christians into vital Christians. Insofar as the evangelical movement was a product of the Great Awakening and became vital Christianity, it was because nominal Christianity was filled with the Spirit and heeded the gospel, and they became vital Christians. That is, overflowing with the Spirit, who was the life of God, alive with God. Then we need to remember, I guess, so we need to attend to our own souls. That's probably primary. We need to remember that revival is more often caught than taught, and therefore we need to be in touch with those who have experienced revival themselves. And you can catch fire, I think, from being with other Christians who have experienced revival, and also by reading about revivals in history and biographies of those who have been ignited by revival fires. Some of these biographies are very, very wonderful and stimulating things. But as we've said throughout this overly long interview, I hope it's not been too boring for you.
Oh, it's been awesome.
Revivals are always sovereign works of God. And they awaken people to the ultimate reality, which is God. Revival is waking up to reality. Therefore, let us focus on what it takes to be God-centered, to understand in your heart what it is to glorify God, rather than thinking of God as one who can just meet my needs. Those are just a few humble suggestions. In our book, Firestorm of the Lord, there's a whole chapter at the end on what the future revival might look like. This book was made up of lectures given at Regent College in Vancouver, and a lot of people came to those lectures because there had just been quite a movement of the Spirit in Canada at that time, and also students who came over from Korea. So they were stimulating lectures, but I remember them telling me that they thought that the next revival would honour the Holy Trinity, because you would become so aware of what the love of the Father, you become so aware of the glory of the Father, the love of Jesus, the power of the Spirit, that there would be a genuine Trinitarian revival. So, who knows? Sovereign work of God.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's so encouraging. Stuart, once again, thank you so much for your time. I've taken up more time than I asked of you. So I appreciate that a lot. And in no way was I bored. I was on the edge of my seat, and it's just been such a fantastic conversation. So thank you once again so much. I really encourage everyone to get hold of these books, particularly Attending to the National Soul, which tells the story of the history of evangelical Christians in Australia from the end of the First World War right up to 2014, sort of really modern day times. So it was a shortlisted book in 2020 for Christian Book of the Year, and definitely encourage everyone to read that. Read anything that Stuart has put together, and thank you again, Stuart, so much for joining me today.
Kurt, it's been a great privilege. Am I just permitted to say one thing about those books? Wonderfully, under the provision of God, a couple of Christians believed it was important to get them out into the public, and therefore they subsidised those books. Now, these books have been published by the secular press, not by Christian publishers, and it's been marvellous that they should have taken it on. And normally, books like this, I mean, both of these books are over 500 pages long. Normally, books like that would cost over $150, but you can get these books for $50 each, and it's an incredible tribute to those people who subsidise them so generously. So I'm very grateful to them. But if your readers your listeners would make sure that they got hold of a copy, I don't think anybody who is serious about the future of the church in Australia should miss out on the chance of finding out as much as you can about what God has really been doing in Australian history, as distinct from the secular histories, which tend to leave God out. So that's why those books are so big. There's just so much to say, and I think that your readers will be astonished at the stories in them. They won't have heard of much of it at all.
Yeah, that's certainly true of me. I mean, there's so much I learned for the first time. It was such spiritual nourishment for me reading these books. So I'm very thankful for you and Robert, Linda for putting them together.
Terrific. Thank you, Kurt. And thanks very much for the video.
Awesome.
Very kind. Bless you.
No problems. Thanks, Stuart.